the MCAT CARS podcast, session number 12. The CARS section of the MCAT gives thousands of pre-meds nightmares every night. Whether you're an ESL student, lack confidence while reading, or are a slow reader like me, Jack Westin and the medical school headquarters are here to help you score higher in every section so you can be confident you are ready to get the MCAT score of your dreams. Welcome to the MCAT CARS podcast. My name is Dr. Ryan Gray, your host here every week, where I'm joined by the amazing Jack Westin, the MCAT CARS tutor. We've joined to bring you the MCAT CARS podcast, and I hope you are enjoying this podcast. If you are, I'd love a rating and review in Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you are listening, wherever you can leave a rating and review. Now, before this week, we've covered a lot of articles breaking down sentences, breaking down paragraphs, trying to get to the heart of what the author is telling us. This week, we get to dive into some AAMC passages, or a AAMC passage, breaking down that AAMC passage, and then answering the questions. So we're jumping into some MCAT-style passage and questions today, where we take a passage from the MCAT 2015 Mini-Test ebook, which is available if you follow the link on our blog post for this episode. This is the MCAT CARS podcast, session number 13. So go find that over at mcatcarspodcast.com. And if you want to just Google it, you can do that as well. MCAT 2015 Mini-Test ebook. You should be able to find that somewhere for you. All right, let's go ahead and dive into this AAMC passage and questions. Jack Westin back for some more CARS podcasts. How you doing today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm excited. Today we're going to dive into some AAMC MCAT material. Why don't you explain what we're going to read today?
Yeah, so I think today's really our first day delving into an MCAT passage, an actual MCAT passage. This was on the exam within the past 10 years. The AAMC has provided this for free to all students on their website. It's under the ebook. It's called 2015 Mini-Test ebook. And we'll link you the ebook so you can find it. It comes with basically, I think, 4 passages, one for each section of the exam. So the one we're going to look at is the CARS section passage, and it comes with 3 questions. So it's a really good passage. It's been on their test before. It also has questions, so we can look at that as well.
Awesome. And yeah, and I always recommend, and I'm sure you do as well, the AAMC, obviously the people who make the test, you want to use as much of their material as possible, including free stuff, paid stuff, whatever it may be. So this is a good little gem that we'll use today to hopefully give you some insight into their thinking.
Yeah, and everything we've done will help. All the other sessions we've had, you're going to see a lot of similarities in terms of their style, in terms of how they present information, how convoluted it could be or how simple it could be. And absolutely, AAMC material is number one, right? You want to make sure that you look over all of their material that they have well before you take your exam. And our CARS passages, we try to mimic their style as much as possible, but nothing comes as close as the AAMC. So that is definitely the golden material that everyone should be using.
Definitely. All right, you ready to get started with this passage?
Yes, let's go ahead.
All right, so this is passage 4 from the MCAT 2015 Mini-Test ebook, which we'll provide a link to on the blog post specifically for this episode. So passage 4, page 17, The Wealth of Nations, 1776, popularized, quote, the individual hand, end quote. The idea that an individual who intends only personal gain is, as it were, led by an invisible hand to promote the public interest. All right, so I'm going to stop here because I'm trying to figure out. So the Invisible Hand, the Wealth of Nations, I'm assuming is a book. It's italicized. It's some publication. and it's talking about the invisible hand, which is led by an invisible hand to promote the public interest. An individual who's going to promote the public interest. Okay.
So this is, I always say this to my students, right? The first sentence sets up a lot. So we really need to understand what's going on here. Because if we don't understand the first sentence, the rest is going to be a lot harder to understand. And I think you get an idea of it, but let's try to actually delve into what they're saying here. So yeah, you're right. The Wealth of Nations, some kind of book, right? It's interesting, 1776, right? The invisible hand, we don't know what that is. The idea that an individual who intends only personal gain. So what does that sound like to you, right? Like
selfish.
Selfish.
Yeah.
To promote the public interest.
Yeah, they're opposite statements.
Exactly. So someone's selfish to promote the public, that is so weird, right? But that's what this book is kind of stressing. That's what this invisible hand idea is. So we'll go with it.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Adam Smith did not assert that this principle was invariably true, but it contributed to a tendency of thoughts that has since remained dominant, preventing action based on rational analysis. The assumption that decisions reached individually will collectively be the best decisions for society as a whole. So Adam Smith, I'm assuming, is the author of this. And the author here is saying that while Adam Smith, the author, didn't say this is a true statement, a lot of people have been kind of using this thought, and it's preventing action. And now it's saying the assumption that decisions reached individually will collectively be the best decisions for society. And again, so there's a lot of weird dichotomies here, that decisions reached individually, and then it says will collectively be the best decision. So I'm very confused as to what they're trying to tell me.
Well, I mean, it's the same thing as the first sentence, right? You have personal gain, right? If you intend personal gain, you promote the public. This is just another way of saying that exact thing. This is saying that if you reach your own decision individually, that for yourself, your own benefit, then it's the best decision for society. The reason why this is so hard to understand, I think, for most students is because this is absurd. How could an individual for yourself help society, right? Like, that doesn't make any. It's like finding, I don't know, an ATM that's just spewing out money, and you just take it for yourself. How is that going to help society?
It's a trickle-down effect, of course.
Maybe that's what they're trying to say. But it's just the reason why this is so hard is because we're not used to understanding things this way, right? It goes against our own perceptions, our own opinions, right? Or the way that we were brought up. So there's a bias that may prevent you from actually understanding this, right? And that's why this is so hard, I think, because it's an idea that we don't agree with. I don't think we agree with. I mean, do you agree with this, Ryan? What do you think?
I don't even know what I'm agreeing to at this point. That's the problem.
Yeah, the problem is it's just saying that when we benefit ourselves, we benefit everyone.
Yeah.
And we don't know with what regard. Like, are we talking about, like, when you benefit from like something like a social status, like money or power? Like, what are you benefiting from that helps everyone? That it's not clear, right? So it's fluffy. It's designed to kind of intimidate you here, but I think you have a good idea of this dichotomy. I mean, let's go ahead and keep reading and let's see what's happening.
If this assumption is correct, it justifies the continuance of the U.S. policy of laissez-faire in many issues affecting business, the environment, and the family. So now it's trying to say that the U.S., it's trying to compare what Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations has stated with the invisible hand. It's now comparing it to U.S. policy, which has affected business, environment, and family.
Right. So maybe if it's correct, it could actually be very important for U.S. policy. Right. It's speculating. It's saying if this assumption is correct. So we don't know if it's a good assumption to make. We don't know if this is a good idea. Hasn't stated it. It just said that this is the idea.
Mm-hmm.
And let's go ahead and let's keep reading and let's see what they say about this. But this sentence is just throwing out an if. What if this happened or what if that happened? We don't know if it's a good idea or not yet.
Yeah.
But if it is a good idea, then it's going to affect U.S.
Yeah. If it is not correct, U.S. citizens need to re-examine their individual freedoms to see which are defensible. So it looks like the author is now stating, okay, if this thought that the Wealth of Nations puts forward isn't correct, then maybe the individual thinking, the personal gain, shouldn't be something that we seek out, but we as individuals need to figure out which ones we want to kind of hold on to. Which ones do we think are the most important?
Yeah, that's exactly what it's trying to say. So it's questioning whether we should do it or not, whether we should abandon parts of it or not. All we got to know is what the idea is. The idea of this paragraph is personal gain for public benefit or for community benefit, which is a very, very hard idea to understand, right? It's a very dense idea. It's abstract in many ways.
Yeah.
So, this is one of the hardest passages on the MCAT, that I've ever seen. For most students, this would be a 9 or 10 out of 10, right? And difficulty.
Mm-hmm.
So if this is hard, this tells you what you need to work on, right? This is the kind of density that could trip you up. So be prepared for anything, especially these denser passages, which may or may not appear on your exam.
Okay. The rebuttal to the invisible hand theory could be called, quote, the tragedy of the commons, unquote. So they're saying the rebuttal, so the opposite of the invisible hand theory, could be called tragedy of the commons. And I'm assuming they were saying tragedy of the commons because instead of individual thinking, that everybody should be thinking the same, and that's what they're referring to as commons. Maybe.
So, okay, do you remember what the invisible hand theory was saying about the commons, about the common people, about the community? What was it saying?
I don't remember.
Well, personal gain for community benefit.
For public interest, yeah.
For public interest. So you're right. This is the rebuttal. The rebuttal means the people who go against this idea, right? People who challenge this idea. The people who challenge this idea call the invisible hand the tragedy of the commons because it's a tragedy to the community. Okay? Instead of calling it tragedy of the invisible hand, which they should have, or tragedy of the public interest, they're calling it something new. They're calling it the commons. So this is their clue that the commons is another way of calling the invisible hand. So it's another name for the invisible hand theory, right?
Okay.
So instead of saying that this idea is tragic, they're saying anyone who's going against the invisible hand theory would call it the tragedy of the commons, which means that they think it's a tragedy. It's a bad thing. The problem is that word commons, most students are not aware that commons is associated to the community, and that's where reading a lot helps. That's where thinking of what you were reading helps, right? So you can kind of connect it to what you were reading.
Okay. Picture a pasture open to all. It can be expected that each herder will try to keep as many cattle as possible on this commons. So it sounds like the author is now trying to paint a picture of each herder who's trying to benefit his personal gain or her personal gain by keeping as many cattle as possible to themselves. That's what I.
Yeah, sounds like the personal gain, right?
Personal gain, yep.
Right, it's suggesting the personal gain stuff. to possibly talk about it, to maybe explain why it might actually be a tragedy or why it might not be good. Go ahead.
Such an arrangement may work reasonably well for centuries because tribal wars, poaching, and disease keep the numbers of both human and beast far below the carrying capacity of the land. And so he's saying, okay, this setup may work for a while, potentially.
Great, yeah. Okay.
Finally, however, comes the day of reckoning. That is the day on which the long-desired goal of social stability becomes a reality. At this point, the inherent logic of the commons remorselessly generates tragedy. And so the author is saying at some point, everybody's getting along. They're keeping their cattle together on these commons, but at some point, something happens. The social stability goes away, but they're not really saying why or what's happened.
Yeah, exactly. They don't explain why it's bad, but they're saying that it leads to some kind of tragedy. Uh-huh. So if you're taking care of yourself, right, and taking as many cattle as you want, somehow you're going to be hurting society. It generates some kind of tragedy. So great job. Yeah, that's it. Now keep in mind that we're going a little bit faster than what I normally would like to go through in a session, just because we want to get to the questions as well. But the course that I have where we go over reading strategies and answering questions breaks down the key things of this paragraph in a very efficient manner. So you're not wasting 2 minutes, 3 minutes going over each paragraph. You won't have time for that, right? Keep in mind that what we're reading today is a glimpse as to what you should be doing on the test, but not exactly the way you should be reading on the exam, because you won't have that time to sit there and think about every single sentence and how to break it down, right? And that's where keeping track of that bigger idea is so important. That's why I really focus on that in the course. So yes, you definitely got the bigger picture down. The bigger picture is we're talking about the tragedy, and the bigger picture is it's explaining a scenario where it leads to a tragedy.
Yep.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, so next paragraph. As a rational being, each herder seeks to maximize personal gain. So again, pointing out the personal gain theory, the invisible hand theory of personal gain for common good. So the author's saying herders are rational beings. They're going to try to maximize their personal gain. More or less consciously, the individual asks, quote, "What is the utility to me of adding one more animal to my herd?" End quote. What is the utility to me of adding? So the herder asks, what's the benefit to me if I add one more animal?
That sounds good, yeah. Okay. So I just want to make something clear here. We're still talking about the same example.
Yep.
The author at the end of the last paragraph interjected that it was bad. And maybe now we're about to talk about why it's bad. So it's kind of weird. It's like talking about something and then interjecting, oh, this is so bad, and then continuing your discussion, explaining it why it's bad, right? Mm-hmm. Usually the author will say it's bad at the very end after they explain themselves, but the author couldn't help themselves. They just, in the middle of their discussion, immediately said it was a tragedy, right? Maybe to help us, maybe to emphasize their point of view, but regardless, that's the way the author is structuring their essay. Go ahead.
Since the herder would receive all the proceeds from the sale of the additional animal, the positive component of this utility is nearly +1. So again, just pointing out one extra animal, then +1 for the herder.
Exactly.
The negative component is a function of the overgrazing caused by an additional animal. So you have another animal, the animal is eating more grass, and maybe potentially is the word that they are using is overgrazing. So maybe they're grazing too much because of an additional animal.
Right.
Since the effects of overgrazing are shared by all the herders, the negative utility for any particular decision maker is some fraction of -1. So a fraction of -1 to me means that it's less than -1 because it's shared by everybody instead of just one.
Exactly. So we get a +1, but everyone else has to get a little bit of that -1, right? To equal it out, to balance everything out. So even though we're getting some kind of positive, that negative is still around, and that negative is shared by everyone else.
Okay. So I'm not seeing the tragedy that the author is potentially pointing to yet. So hopefully it comes.
Right, but you do understand the mechanism, right, of how it's working. That's the key. Yep. So you know that everyone's getting a +1 if you get your own animal, right? And eventually everyone else gets a negative version of that because you got that +1.
Yeah.
So some kind of mechanism, some kind of utilities going on here. Go ahead.
Adding the component utilities, the rational herder concludes that the only sensible course is to add another animal to his or her herd, and another, and another. This conclusion is reached by every rational herder who shares the commons. Okay. So now we're seeing that everybody, all the herders, are saying, hey, if I can get +1 for every extra animal, and I only have to share a part of the negative, why wouldn't I keep adding more pluses?
Exactly. Okay.
All are locked into a system that compels each to increase his or her gain without limit in a world that is limited. So here now we're the author's setting up where the tragedy may come, because the herder is thinking only about themselves and thinking that I can add more and more cattle, but we're in a limited world of resources, and so there is going to be a problem at some point.
Great.
Ruin is the destination toward which all rush, each pursuing the right to use a public resource. So the tragedy here, it looks like the author is saying, is ruin that we're rushing towards. The problem is that a commons, if justifiable at all, is justifiable only under conditions of low population density. So the author is kind of drawing back to the herder scenario of saying, okay, you have herders, you have cattle in a commons in some area of land. And sure, it's justifiable, these conditions, but only if it's a low population density. Only if they're, I think as the author is saying, is they're low enough that everything makes sense, and we're not rushing towards ruining our resources.
Right. Low population seems to be the only time you can actually use the commons, or this invisible hand idea. Okay?
As the human population has increased, the commons concept has had to be abandoned in one aspect after another. And so now it sounds like we're getting away from the scenario of the herders, and now we're talking about our world in general, of saying, hey, our human population has increased, and this commons concept has had to be abandoned. Okay.
So what kind of theme are you noticing here? Does the author like this idea of the commons, or not like this idea of the commons?
I think only until... the herder scenario, it sounded like he or she wasn't for it. But this last sentence really solidifies in my mind that the author does not like the commons concept.
Exactly. And if you can get that, you can pretty much get all the questions right.
Okay.
So knowing that big point, knowing that, hey, look, the author doesn't like the commons. I mean, every paragraph we've talked about, we've read, has had something to do with the commons being a tragedy, or it leads to ruin, or something along those lines. So it gives you an idea that, hey, maybe the author really doesn't like this idea. Mm-hmm. Okay, go ahead.
The social arrangements that would produce responsibility in this scenario create coercion. So, social arrangements that would produce responsibility in this scenario. So, I think the author is saying in this scenario, meaning our world as a overpopulated world. That's the scenario I'm assuming they're saying. And then social arrangements just being how we use our resources, I think, how we agree to use our resources. Maybe?
Right. It's not the clearest sentence, but something leads to coercion, which we don't really know what coercion is. Like what is coercion? So hopefully they'll explain it. Let's go ahead.
The only kind of coercion I recommend is mutual coercion, agreed to by a majority of those affected. So mutual coercion. So everybody agrees to be coerced in some way, agreed to by a majority of those affected. Again, I'm not really sure where they're going with this yet.
Right. So you're right. There's some kind of agreement that we all have to be coerced, forced to do something. Let's go ahead and keep reading.
Compulsory taxes are acceptable because a system of voluntary contributions would favor the conscienceless. Okay, so coercion, they're potentially saying, hey, taxes are coercion, I think is what they're saying, and they're acceptable because they're forced, and if we had voluntary contributions, it would favor the conscienceless because the conscienceless wouldn't care and wouldn't contribute.
Right. So that's really good. That's really deep. So what is the key to coercion? What does the author associate coercion to?
Forcing everybody to do something.
What is that thing that the author's
taxing?
Taxing.
Yeah. Exactly.
Taxes are something that everyone needs to do, right? And I mean, this kind of relates to our own lives, right? And yeah, that's it. That's coercion. So maybe the author is for taxes. Okay, let's go ahead.
A society institutes and grumblingly supports taxes and other coercive devices to escape the horror of the commons. So the author is saying, hey, this is how we live right now. We as a society, we institute these taxes and other coercive devices to escape the tragedy that the author was stating could happen because of this invisible hand.
Right. So it seems like the author is creating a distinction between taxes and the commons. The commons, or this idea of invisible hand theory, seems to be negative, seems to lead to tragedy. And the solution, the way that we prevent this tragedy, seems to be from taxes or other coercive devices.
Yep.
Okay.
All right, last paragraph. Every new enclosure of the commons involves the infringement of somebody's personal freedom. Enclosure of the commons. I'm not sure what that is referring to.
Well, I mean, it's talking about the commons and saying it's infringing on your freedom. So does that sound like a positive thing or a negative thing?
It sounds like a negative thing, but I would get hung up on what enclosure of the commons means.
Yeah, so enclosure of the commons means if you submit yourself to actually executing the commons, right? If you actually end up doing the commons. If you enclose yourself to the commons, that means that you're focused on doing the commons.
Oh, okay.
Right? So it's their way of saying, look, if you actually do this, you're going to be limiting someone's freedom. Now, is freedom important or not? Who knows? We could still keep track of that and understand it, but hopefully they'll clarify why it's hurting our freedoms. Go ahead.
But what does, quote, freedom mean? Those subject to the logic of the commons are free only to bring on universal ruin. So the first sentence is infringement on somebody's personal freedom, and the author asks the question, what does freedom actually mean? And they immediately, it looks like, attack the commons, the thought of the commons, saying those who support the commons are free only to bring on universal ruin, are only there to hurt everybody. Yeah,
so the author goes into this sarcastic kind of remark. It doesn't really explain freedom. I mean, basically says it in a way to present the idea that the commons is a bad idea.
Yeah.
That's it. Like, they don't really care about freedom. Like the author is not trying to emphasize how we lose freedom, right? It's just saying that, look, commons is bad. That's ultimately what the author is trying to say in a fluffy way.
Once they acknowledge the logic of mutual coercion, they become free to pursue other goals. I'm assuming they're saying they as the people who are subject to the logic of the commons. And they're saying, so once those people acknowledge mutual coercion and the logic behind it, they're free, going back to the freedom, they are free to pursue other goals.
Sounds good. So again, I see this difference between coercion and the commons, right? Commons seems to be bad, coercion seems to be good. I always like to see things in terms of good or bad, because all these passages are very arguable and it's all about the author's opinion. So if I know the author is going for something or against something, that helps me simplify what I'm reading. It helps me understand the bigger picture. So commons, bad, coercion, good. That's what's happening in my mind as I read. Okay, go ahead.
We must now recognize the necessity of abandoning the commons assumption in our reproduction. Reproduction. I don't know if they're talking about like reproducing of children or reproduction of stuff, but reproduction. So the author is basically making the bold claim here: we need to stop thinking about this commons theory, this invisible hand theory.
Good. That's it. We don't know what reproduction really means. Probably reproduction of our societies, thriving. Who knows? Go ahead.
Failure to do so will bring ruin on us all. So again, another bold statement. The author is clearly stating commons is bad.
Right. It brings ruin. I mean, this last sentence sums up the passage pretty well. Right. Now, the reason why most students are not going to probably do well on the questions is because they're so intimidated. Right. What the heck did I just read? Right. Like, what is this talking about? This is not normal English, right? This is not the kind of English that we talk, on a daily or consistent basis. So you have to challenge yourself to be uncomfortable. You have to be uncomfortable with this. It's okay, right? So it's not your fault if you don't understand this. Everyone is feeling the same pressure. Everyone is feeling the same way. So the biggest advice I can give anyone who's reading this stuff is don't give up, right? Just stick to what you know. It's kind of like being a physician, right? You're not going to know every little problem the patient will have, but if you can pick up on the things that you know are wrong with them, you can start figuring out what the issue may actually be, the underlying issue is. So try to figure out clues from this passage. Try to figure out what you do know. I know that commons is bad. Now, the hard part is connecting commons to the invisible hand, and that's a technique that you can learn. The other part of this passage that I think is really important is that coercion is good. Coercion is a solution. Mm-hmm. And those are things that you could have picked up without knowing all the little, all these little random sentences that they presented. So you could pick up on the big ideas pretty easily without worrying too much about every single detail. Knowing what's important and what's not is the key. And that's what I try to focus on in the course, and what we're, hopefully we can try to emulate here. Yeah. Okay, so great. So what we know the big picture, right? Obviously, commons is bad. Mm-hmm. Let's go ahead and try to answer some of these questions. There's only 3 questions here.
Okay.
And before we actually talk about questions themselves are challenging because you have to. I think there's a certain consistency to them that you need. You need to be consistent in the way you look at them. So one of the big things I always stress to my own students, and something I also teach in the free session that I have, is to summarize the question. Because if you can't summarize the question, you really don't know what it's asking. So that's something that we're going to do every time we read a question together. Let's summarize the first question. So go ahead and read it, and let's summarize it. Let's see what it's truly asking us. Go ahead.
Let me ask one question before a student jumps into questions. Is there any sort of procedure, any sort of algorithm or checklist that you recommend students do? Like, did I understand the main points? Did I understand the author's point of view? Do you have any sort of checklist before a student jumps to questions that students should be running through?
definitely the main point, right? And definitely the points that were made in each paragraph. So yeah, so the structure, how did the essay evolve from the beginning to the end? I'm always thinking of that as I read. And definitely the main point, like we stressed, right? Commons bad, right? I mean, if you just know commons is bad, who knows? You may be able to get a lot of questions right. And that's my philosophy on this. Keep it simple, focus on the things that you do know, and let's see how it goes.
Okay. So passage 4, question 1, page 19 from this MCAT 2015 Mini-Test ebook. According to the passage, the decisive factor in determining whether someone's actions should be subject to coercion is whether the actions A are determined solely by self-interest, B...
Be careful. Got to summarize the question before you read the answer choices.
Okay.
So what is the question asking?
So the question is asking, what should determine... So the decisive factor in determining whether someone's actions should be subject to coercion.
Easier said than done, right?
Yeah. So it's funny in my head. I'm like, oh, I know exactly what they're asking, but trying to change it into something different. It's so let me put it in the terms that they used in the passage. It's how should we determine whether someone's actions should be taxed? Whether someone's actions are against the common good, maybe.
Well, being more okay. So I definitely think you understand the question, but you're kind of dancing around the question, right? So your question is, when should we actually do coercion?
Yeah.
Right. So when should we do coercion? Right. So like that's the question. So I mean, the only thing we talked about with coercion, like you said, there are taxes. That's all we know, right? You should do coercion when you have some kind of common situation, and the solution would be taxes or something along those lines.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's great. Now, this is a pain point for a lot of students. A lot of students read the question and go, "Why do I need to summarize it? Why do I need to it takes me so long to do? This is a technique. This is a skill. You might not be great at it in the beginning." But once you start getting a hang of it, you're going to be at a different level, because you can put these things in simple terms. And when you put things in simple terms, everything becomes simpler. Because if you were just to read the question, you're more likely than not, you're going to probably be lost when you get to the answer choices, because you're not going to know what to look for. But if I summarize the question, I know what I'm looking for. I'm looking for something that tells me I should do coercion. Mm-hmm. When should I do coercion? Right? That's basically what it's asking. So what factor do I need to look at in order to implement coercion or coercive devices? Okay?
Yep.
All right. So yes, it is tough to do. It will take some time. But my students who do this on a regular basis, and they work on this, and we reinforce this in the class, they become pros at this. And it doesn't take that long. It's kind of like muscle memory. It's kind of like it's like something you build. It's like a brain kind of muscle kind of thing that you got to gain over time, over practice. So yeah, go ahead.
All right. So A, are determined solely by self-interest. B, affect collectively held resources. C, degrade the natural environment. Or D, are commonly considered immoral. So for me, I think the answer jumps right out, but I'm going to run down a couple of them because I think they throw a couple of these answers in here to potentially throw us off. So I'm going to start with C, degrade the natural environment, because they gave us this example of the herders and cattle and overgrazing. Degrading the natural environment kind of stands out, like, oh, that's when we should use coercion. And I don't know if that's the right answer. So I'm going to cross out C.
Okay, so let's go ahead. I think that was great. You definitely recognize that they're using elements of the passage to distort the actual idea, right? So they're using elements of the passage that you might have clung onto, like overgrazing, to potentially pick C. I mean, there are
Yeah.
students that will overthink it and go, oh, overgrazing, so it must be natural environment. But don't forget, your goal is to answer the question.
Yep.
The question is, when should we do coercion, right? When should things be subject to coercion? So is it when you have overgrazing? But is that even what this is saying? Because overgrazing doesn't necessarily even mean degrading the natural environment, right? Degrading the natural environment seems like you're not recycling, or you're ruining the I don't know, the earth in some way, right? You're polluting the earth in some way. I don't know if overgrazing could even be considered that, right? I mean, that might be a stretch, if anything. So yes, C would be wrong. Great. Go ahead. What's your next answer choice?
So the next one that kind of jumps out as something that I kind of remember from the passage is D, are commonly considered immoral. Because that immoral kind of is similar to the sentence that says compulsory taxes are acceptable because a system of voluntary contributions would favor the conscienceless. And so conscienceless and immoral to me are kind of synonyms. And again, I think it's trying to play on my recall of the conscienceless and go, oh yeah, I remember that it said compulsory taxes should be used when there's conscienceless people.
Okay.
And so that one I would go, yeah, but I don't think that one's right, because it's not answering the question.
Right. So conscienceless or not has nothing to do with immoral. So you're creating a bias there. You're supposing that conscienceless or not, or being conscious, has something to do with immoral. Morality. Morality is not related to consciencelessness or whatever you want to call it, right? Immoral means that it's not good. Conscienceless means you're not thinking about it, right? So you're connecting them together when there really isn't a connection to be made. Immoral was simply not discussed. We don't discuss whether something is moral or not moral. It's beyond the scope of the passage. But one thing that you're hitting the nail on the head here. A lot of students like to connect things to the details, right? Don't connect things to the details. Those details are there to distract you. Focus on the bigger picture. The bigger picture is answering the question, right? When should we do coercion? When things are immoral? Like, that doesn't even make sense. Right? Coercion should be done when things are immoral. I mean, if you think about it, it doesn't answer the question. So yes, D would be wrong. Okay, go ahead.
And so we're left with A and B, and if that's all you're left with, I'm assuming that's good, right? 50-50 is better than 25%. And the one that jumps out at me as the correct answer is B, affect collectively held resources. And so again, going back to the commons of having limited resources, right? A land that's being grazed by animals. If we are only thinking about ourselves, we are going to use up these collectively held resources because there are other herders on this land. And if we allow people to only act in their best interest, things are going to go haywire. Therefore, we need coercion to prevent that. And so I would go with B as the answer.
Yeah, B is the best answer. And let's kind of break down why A is wrong. First of all, it's saying, when should we do coercion? When the actions are determined solely by self-interest? That is kind of extreme. Every action that is determined by self-interest needs coercion. That's not the point the author is making. The point the author is making is that if you're going to share a resource, which is what B is saying, then you should be taxed. You should have coercion, right? Because you all share that resource. And you pointed out the whole herd example, right? You realize the herd was a resource that we all used. So we should use coercion. We should use that when you have some kind of commonality, some kind of community, right? Not when you're focused on yourself, right? That wouldn't really answer the question. I mean, a lot of students will look at it and go, well, isn't the whole reason why we're doing coercion is because we're so self-centered? Mm-hmm. That's great, but A is not saying that. A is not saying that we're self-centered towards a society. It's saying just that we're self-centered, which is too extreme. So
Okay.
typically when I see an answer choice that seems too extreme, it's usually wrong. So solely is extreme, right? I don't like those kinds of answers. Now, in some cases, which I talk about in the course, extreme answers can be correct, right? There are cases where they can be correct, but most of the time I would say they're wrong. So A is a good example of something extreme that doesn't necessarily cater to the passage, that makes it out of scope, makes it random, makes it irrelevant to the bigger picture of this, of the resources of the herd, if that makes sense.
Okay.
Okay, great. So yes, question number 1, the answer is B. Great. All right, let's go ahead and do number 2. This is a Roman numeral question, which is just as good. I love Roman numeral questions.
See, Roman numerals for me as a student reading this, like they automatically raise my stress level because Roman numerals always seem to be the hardest ones for me.
Let me give you a big tip. This is actually easier.
Interesting. Okay.
Because how many answer choices do we have in the last question?
4.
How many answer choices do we have here?
3. There's 3 Roman numerals.
That's it. So it's easier, right?
Okay.
So if you actually understand these Roman numerals, you should get to the right answer faster because there's only 3 choices. There's really, I mean, I know there's A, B, C, and they have all these different categories and combinations, but don't focus on that. Focus on the Roman numerals. That's where all the meat is. That's where all the juice is, right? So it shouldn't be any different. It's just an easier question. Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
All right, so passage 4, question 2. The passage argument suggests that national parks might benefit from Roman numeral 1, the restriction...
What is the question asking?
Oh, I thought the Roman numerals were part of the question. So the passage argument, so it's asking what are national parks going to benefit from based on the argument of the passage.
Great. Okay. So now you can go ahead and read the Roman numerals, but think about this. What did we talk about in terms of benefits? What's the only thing we mentioned in terms of benefits?
Coercion is good.
That's it. Okay, go ahead.
All right. So Roman numeral 1, the restriction of recreational use by means of fees. 2, the selling of the facilities to private investors. Or 3, the opening of additional facilities to the public. So coercion is good makes one stand out as potentially something that makes sense, right? Restriction based on fees, based on taxes. So one stands out as a potential right answer. Roman numeral 2, to me, doesn't seem like it has any basis. The selling of the facilities to private investors, that's not a taxing thing. That's benefiting one person, right? The investors. So that doesn't seem to be logical, I don't think. And then 3, the opening of additional facilities to the public is an interesting one to me because it's saying, well, maybe we're not going to have limited resources, so let's open additional facilities, and then we don't have to tax. So 1 and 3 kind of are interesting to me, with 1 looking like the most obvious answer, but it's Roman numeral, so let's see what the answer choices hold. So A is 1 only, B is 3 only, so that's interesting, the 2 that I'm kind of looking at. C is 1 and 2 only, which is interesting because 2 is one that I crossed out. And D is 2 and 3 only. And again, 2 I crossed out pretty early. So hopefully I'm right that I crossed out 2. And I said that I was leaning more towards 1, which leaves me with the answer choice as A, 1 only.
Great. That's it. So you focused on taxes, right? Which they mentioned. They mentioned taxes. Number 1 reminds us of taxes, right? When you use a recreation, a public resource like a park, and you have fees, that's taxing, right? Number 2, like you said, it's kind of weird because it seems like you're having some kind of benefit through like self-interest when you sell stuff. It's actually beyond the passage. I mean, we don't need to connect it to the passage. It's just never really discussed. So I think it was really great that you killed number 2, which would make this a lot easier, because if you kill number 2, then you have no choice but to kill C and D. So it comes down to 1 and 3. There's something really interesting about number 3. When you open up more facilities, does that help the problem or does that hurt the problem?
I don't know. There's more resources.
But doesn't that mean that we have more opportunities to be selfish?
Selfish, right? Yeah.
Yeah, so this is kind of going against the coercion idea. This is actually contradicting the coercion idea. This is suggesting that opening up facilities is a good thing, and we don't want that. We don't want to open up more facilities. We want to restrict things with fees, right? And which is what number 1 is saying. So yes, A would be the best answer.
Alrighty. So I'm 2 for 2.
Yeah, you are. Good job. Go ahead.
All right. So passage 4, question 3. Some communities with expanding populations have for centuries successfully managed commonly held land. An appropriate clarification of the passage would be the stipulation that the author's argument applies only to. All right, so what is the question asking? This is a weird question. So the first part of the question is saying that, hey, some communities with growing populations, and the author said that with our growing population, we need to have this coercion. And the author is saying that there are communities with expanding populations that have successfully managed commonly held land. So almost against the author's stance. Yeah. An appropriate clarification of the passage would be the stipulation that the author's argument applies only to. So the question is asking, how do we change, how do we clarify, how do we add something to the passage to make it more true, I think?
Right. Yeah, so it's a hard question to understand, but I think you broke it down pretty well. First half is suggesting that expanding populations, so big populations, have been successful in managing commonly held land. So they've been good at doing this invisible hand theory, using the commons, which is kind of contradicting what the author said. The author said that as the population grows, they have to abandon the commons. So this is suggesting that it's actually a positive, and that's weird. So the second part of the question is saying, how could the author clarify their point of view in order for this to be true? Mm-hmm. So what does the author's argument apply to only, so that this isn't really affected, that this could also work, right? So we're focused on really, what is the author's argument applying to? That's the key. What is the author's argument? So focus on what the author said, and you'll probably get to the right answer.
Okay. So answer choice A is the future. B, unregulated resources. C, conditions of social instability. Or D, resources that are not managed locally. So right off the bat, I'm going to cross out D, because locally versus virtually versus whatever, like, I don't think that ever came up potentially anywhere in the author's argument. So I'm going to cross that one out immediately. The future is interesting because the question is saying, hey, for centuries this has been done, and so I think it's very easy for me to jump at, oh, of course, then they want that it's only going to apply to the future if it also worked, if it worked in the past. So I'm going to be careful with A. B is unregulated resources, and C, conditions of social instability. And again, for C, social instability is an interesting one, because I don't think the author ever talked about social instability or stability. It just talked about growth and population growth and not instability.
Right. They mentioned the word instability. So it might throw you off, but you're right. They never bring this idea up. Right.
And so the only answer choice left for me is B, unregulated resources, because I think they're saying if we have regulated resources, they're kind of maybe already being quote unquote taxed in some way because they're being regulated, and so the author's argument should apply only to unregulated resources to clarify it.
That was great. The thing that you did that really stands out, and I think everyone should really pay attention to, is you tried to answer the question. You thought about what the question was saying, and you tried to finish the question. So you were like, oh, author's argument applies only to the future. That could make sense, because we're talking about the past for centuries, in the first part of the question. But did we ever talk about the future?
No.
That's why it's wrong. It was never brought up in the passage. Now, in some cases, there are questions that can throw in hypotheticals, like which of the following could be the right answer if this or that, or which of the following would support the author's opinion, or in those cases, it's okay to go beyond the passage, but it still has to be relevant to the passage. Future is not relevant to the passage, nor is instability or locally, like you said. So you picked up on A, C, and D not being relevant to the passage, and B is. I mean, the whole passage is about using some kind of resource, some kind of herd maybe, or some kind of common land that necessarily isn't regulated. So it clarifies the author's points of view and also solves the issue that we had with the first part of the question.
All right, so definitely not what I would have done on a real MCAT. Thinking back to my MCAT score, where I scored on the old MCAT a 7, which is a 120. I don't even know.
125.
Yeah, roughly a 125 maybe on the new MCAT. It was my weakest section. My science scores were much higher than that. And then, so verbal, again, is my weakness. But using the skills that you've been teaching me over the last several weeks as we go through this, and obviously taking a long time to break down these passages and the sentences and clarifying the question, really, it almost makes it like a no-brainer. Be like, of course that's the answer.
Yeah. So I think a lot of students will look at this and go, well, you just broke it down and, it took you an hour to break down one passage. And that's true. The goal is for you to be able to do this with no time in order to be able to do it with time. It's like saying, can I do something in 8 minutes if I really don't, or 10 minutes if I really don't know how to do it to begin with? I think the goal of every student should be, hey, look, can I do this with no timer? Is it possible to understand what I'm doing without a timer? And it seemed like you were able to do that, Ryan, right? Like we were able to do that with no timer. We were able to understand it. For many students, it's hard to do even with no timer, right?
Yeah.
And then we work on pacing, right? And adjust. And my students have no problem with timing when they become very good at thinking through things, right? Your ability to think through the passage allowed you to answer these questions more effectively, right? Your ability to understand the question allowed you to answer the question more effectively, more efficiently. So it's a lot that happens. It's a skill that you have to acquire, I think, or over a lot of practice, a lot of effort. But it can be done. It's something that can definitely be improved with patience. Now, I know there are always students that suggest, oh, well, I've always had a reading problem, or, oh, I'm not good at reading. I think that's a defeating kind of attitude that you just have to get over, right? Once you realize that you can be good at anything you put your mind to, CARS becomes achievable, right? Doing well on CARS is something that can be achieved within a matter of months, right? So it's just like anything else. You need to prepare, but if you prepare well, you should be good to go.
I have this discussion a lot with ESL students when they talk to me about their struggles with the MCAT, and I tell them, I'm like, you're probably telling yourself the whole time that you're reading a passage, I suck at English, I suck at English, I suck at English, and because you're telling yourself that, you have no idea what you're reading because you're filling your brain with your negative message, and therefore you obviously are. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy because you're doing poorly because you're telling yourself that you do poorly.
Right. And keep in mind that the way I teach it in the course is literally a formula, right? Do this, do that, do this. And once you start doing those things over and over again, my students usually get a lot of confidence from that because they see that it's achievable. If I just do this and then that, which I should have been able to do because we break it down, you can easily see what the right answer is. And part of that is reading for understanding the question, right? Summarizing the question. There's a lot that we didn't get to, simply because we don't have a lot of time, right? Eventually, I'm hoping that we can talk about those things and touch on those things. But definitely, this is a challenging passage, but I think anyone can really look at this the right way if they put their mind to it.
All right, there you have it. Hopefully, this was a great example for you, a great way to put into context, into effect, everything that we've been teaching you over the last several weeks, over the last couple months. Actually, it's been a while since we launched, which is amazing. And hopefully with a quote-unquote real passage from the AAMC, the skills that we've been teaching you along the way, you're able to pull all of those skills together to get through the passage, understand the passage, and get through the questions. Because really, that's what it's all about. I've talked to enough students who say, well, I understand the passage. It's trying to understand the questions and pull it all together is where the student is falling down. So hopefully the skills that you're learning through this podcast will help you with this passage and with every other passage that you encounter on your journey to the MCAT and beyond. If you're looking for some more personalized attention with your MCAT CARS strategy, with your MCAT CARS prep, go check out medicalschoolhq.net/Jack Westin and learn about his MCAT CARS strategy course. By going to that link, it automatically activates a $100 coupon that you can use towards the MCAT CARS strategy course, where you are going to get over 70 hours of instruction to learn, to master the critical thinking skills necessary to get the CARS score of your dreams. You'll get personalized attention. You'll gain confidence with clear, proven methods from Jack Westin, the expert in the CARS section. Go to medicalschoolhq.net/Jack Westin to activate that $100 off coupon, or text the word CARS coupon to 44222, and we'll send you that link as well. Hope you have a great week. We'll see you next time here on the MCAT CARS podcast. When you use the links provided in this podcast, you're helping to support MedEd Media and the podcasts that we produce. Not only do you get a discount, but we earn a small commission as well. Thank you for your support.